Aina Yusuf thought her wedding night would mark the beginning of a new life. But within 24 hours, her husband, Amirul Hakim, turned from a loving groom into a violent stranger. After discovering a truth she had spent her entire life hiding, Amirul Hafiz was the kind of man many parents prayed their daughters would marry. He was successful, respectful, and known for his strong religious values. At 32, he had everything except a wife. He lived in a high-rise apartment in Kuala Lumpur, ran a halal logistics company, and regularly donated to his local mosque. Despite several proposals over the years, none had felt right. He wanted someone modest, God-fearing, and elegant in her demeanor. After much persuasion from his family, he agreed to register with a local matchmaking agency that catered exclusively to Muslim professionals looking for serious, Sharia-compliant relationships. That decision would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The agency, known as Sakina Connections, was reputable on the surface. It promised confidentiality, background checks, and a focus on Islamic values. Within a month, they introduced him to Nur Aina. She was 28, soft-spoken, and lived in Petaling Jaya. Her profile listed her as a former lecturer now running a small Islamic fashion boutique online. Her pictures showed her in modest clothing, with a calm, inviting smile. Amirul was intrigued. They began speaking through chaperoned video calls. Aina spoke gently, always referring to God's plan and the importance of a righteous marriage. She avoided deep, personal questions, always circling back to faith and compatibility. Amirul appreciated her humility. She never flirted or tried to impress him. Her answers were measured, her expressions reserved, and her voice carried a sense of mystery. She told him she had endured hardships in her past, but chose not to go into detail. He respected her privacy, believing her silence was part of her dignity. Over the course of 2 months, the agency facilitated their discussions. His family met hers briefly, though only one uncle represented Aina's side, claiming her parents were elderly and unwell. Still, everything seemed above board. There were no obvious red flags. The wedding was held in early September at a hotel ballroom. The Akad Nikah, the Islamic marriage contract, was performed in front of a qadi and a small gathering of witnesses. Aina wore a soft beige baju kurung with lace trimmings, her face mostly covered by a veil. Amirul noticed she kept her eyes low throughout the ceremony. Some guests whispered that the bride seemed too shy, but others saw it as a sign of humility and piety. The Imam praised the union as one built on trust, patience, and obedience to Allah. Everything went smoothly. The guests enjoyed a buffet, exchanged gifts, and took pictures. Aina barely spoke to anyone, only offering short greetings and smiles. Amirul's friends teased him about marrying such a quiet woman, but he dismissed their comments. "Some women are just modest," he replied, convinced that Aina's silence was part of her charm. They left for his apartment in the evening, exhausted from the day but looking forward to starting their new life together. At the apartment, Amirul gave her a tour of the space and asked if she wanted to unpack or rest. She chose to rest. She took her bag into the guest room and said she wanted to sleep there for the night, explaining that she was overwhelmed and needed time. Amirul didn't protest. He assumed she was just nervous, maybe even frightened. It wasn't unusual, he thought, for a woman to need time to adjust after such a big change. Besides, she hadn't resisted the marriage. She'd gone along with everything, so he believed she only needed patience. That night he stayed awake longer than usual, thinking about her. He felt both excited and uncertain. There were so many things he didn't know about her, but he trusted that marriage would naturally open the door to intimacy and connection. He reminded himself that good things come slowly, and that true Islamic marriage is built on patience, not passion. The next morning, Aina emerged from the room fully covered, in a long dress and headscarf. She prepared breakfast quietly and spoke little. Amirul tried asking her about her plans for the day, if she wanted to begin setting up her belongings in their shared room. She simply said she would take things one day at a time. She kept glancing at the clock and checking her phone, as if waiting for something. That same day, while she was in the bathroom, Amirul noticed that her suitcase was still zipped shut. He thought he might help her unpack, thinking it would be a sweet gesture. When he opened it, he saw her clothing neatly folded, and at the bottom, a small leather folder. Curiosity got the better of him. He opened it and found several foreign documents. Letters from a hospital in Thailand, certificates, and medical history records written in English. Confused, he skimmed through the papers. Words like post-operative, hormone therapy, and gender reassignment jumped out at him. At first, he didn't understand. Then realization hit him like a storm. He stood frozen in the room, unable to breathe. His heart pounded. His hands trembled. Everything around him began to spin. He looked again, hoping he had misunderstood, hoping it was a mistake. But the name on the documents matched the one on her passport, Nur Aina Binti Mod Isa. Except, earlier records listed a different name. Muhammad Arif Isa Amirul collapsed into a chair, shocked, furious, and confused. He had not married a woman with a hidden past. He had married someone who, according to his beliefs and the law he respected, was never allowed to be his wife. His mind reeled. Had he been deceived? Was this a scam? Had everyone known except him? He didn't say anything to Aina that day. He acted normal, but something in his demeanor shifted. She noticed, but she didn't question it. That night, she went to bed early again. Amirul stayed up all night, pacing the floor. A volcano of emotions bubbled under the surface. Anger, betrayal, shame. He didn't know who to blame. Aina for hiding the truth, the agency for allowing it, himself for being too trusting. The marriage had only lasted a few hours, but the damage was already taking shape. The apartment that was meant to be their new beginning had become a pressure cooker of secrets, silence, and rising tension. By the next morning, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after their wedding dawned quietly. The sun filtered through the blinds in Amirul's high-rise apartment, casting golden lines across the living room floor. In the silence, Amirul sat on the edge of the bed, hunched over, the medical documents spread out before him like shards of a broken mirror. His thoughts were scattered, crashing into each other. Aina's presence in the other room suddenly felt foreign, even dangerous. Everything he had believed about her, everything he thought he knew, now stood on uncertain ground. He kept replaying their conversations, her subtle deflections, her quiet voice. What once seemed like modesty now felt like a disguise. He remained in his room for hours, unsure of what to say or do. He hadn't slept at all. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind wouldn't rest. Every sound from the other room made him flinch. The clinking of dishes, the soft creak of the guest room door, the running water in the bathroom, it all reminded him that she was still here, and that he still didn't know what would happen. Next, Aina eventually knocked gently on his door and left a tray of breakfast outside. She said nothing. Amirul didn't open the door until he heard her footsteps fade away. When he finally picked up the tray, he stared at the untouched food: boiled eggs, toast, and a mug of warm Milo. It looked normal. That was what disturbed him the most. How normal everything still seemed on the outside, when inside his world was falling apart. He spent the day avoiding her. He didn't go to work. He told his assistant he was taking the day off for rest. Inside, he paced and waited. Waited for anger to settle, or for clarity to arrive. But clarity never came. Only waves of growing confusion and resentment. He felt humiliated. He imagined what his friends and family would say if they ever found out. He wondered how many people knew already. Was he the last one to see the truth? In the late afternoon, Amirul checked his phone and searched for the name of the hospital listed in the documents. It was a private clinic in Bangkok specializing in gender reassignment surgeries. It all checked out. The dates matched. The timelines made sense. There was even assigned approval from a psychologist. Aina had been living as a woman for several years. Her transition had been medically complete. Her identification, at least, outside of the Islamic system, recognized her as female. But in Malaysia, under Sharia law, she was still classified according to her birth identity. That alone made their marriage invalid in the eyes of the religious courts. The weight of that realization crashed down on Amirul. He hadn't just been deceived, he had entered into a marriage that, according to his beliefs and community, should never have happened. His blood boiled. He tried to breathe slowly, to pray to calm down, but it wasn't working. His thoughts spiraled into darker places. Evening arrived, and Aina emerged from her room. She was dressed modestly, just as she always had been. She looked tired but composed. She asked Amirul softly if he wanted to talk. He said nothing. His silence was sharp and heavy. She looked at him, as if searching for some hint of mercy in his expression. But he turned away. Her voice trembled, slightly as she said she hoped they could work through things. That was the last time she spoke that evening. Night fell, and the apartment seemed colder. Amirul hadn't eaten. He kept pacing, opening drawers, slamming them shut, staring out the window with a clenched jaw. He was at war with himself. Part of him still remembered how soft her voice had been during their first call, how she had spoken about building a home rooted in faith. He remembered the smile she gave when he first told her he admired her values. He had believed her. He had pictured a future with her: children, prayer, companionship. All of it now felt like a carefully crafted lie. The breaking point came just after midnight. Amirul opened her suitcase again, this time pulling out everything he could find: her clothes, her documents, her prayer mat. He scattered them across the living room floor, desperate for some sign that this wasn't real, that he had somehow misunderstood. But the truth was undeniable, and the rage, after hours of being bottled up, finally erupted. Aina heard the noise and came out, shocked by the mess. Her eyes widened when she saw what he had done. Still, she didn't raise her voice. She walked slowly toward him, trying to speak, but Amirul snapped. He charged at her with a fury he had never known in himself. He screamed, not words, but raw emotion. He pushed her, and she stumbled. He struck her across the face. She fell to the floor, then another blow, and another. It was violent, sudden, and terrifying. Neighbors later told police they heard crashing and yelling but couldn't make out the words. The building's night security guard received a complaint about noise and came to check. When he knocked and received no answer, He used his key to enter. What he found inside shocked him. Aina lay on the ground near the coffee table, blood running from her lip, her arms raised in a feeble attempt to shield herself. Amirul stood over her, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. The documents were scattered across the floor like confetti. The guard immediately called the police. When they arrived, Amirul didn't resist. He was eerily calm, as if the storm had passed and left him hollow. He was arrested on the spot. Aina was taken to the hospital, where doctors treated her bruises and cuts. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but the emotional scars ran deep. She said little to the nurses. When asked if she wanted to press charges, she simply nodded. Word of the incident spread quickly. Local media got wind of the story within hours, and social media was ablaze with speculation. A well-known businessman arrested for assaulting his wife within 24 hours of marriage would have been shocking enough. But when the reports hinted at the nature of Aina's identity, the story exploded. In that single violent night, everything changed for both of them. Amirul, once the ideal Muslim groom, became a man haunted by shame and scandal. Aina, who had long tried to live quietly and honestly, became the face of a storm she had never wanted to provoke. Behind the headlines, behind the outrage and curiosity, were two broken people trapped in a collision of identity, faith, and betrayal. What began as a celebration had turned into a nightmare, one that neither of them could wake from. The following hours unfolded like a nightmare, slow and surreal. Amirul was taken into custody, his wrists bound in cold steel as he sat in the back of the police car, silent, his eyes fixed on nothing. His mind was numb, replaying fragments of what had happened. Her face, his fists, the shouting, the sudden quiet. In the hospital, Aina lay on a gurney under fluorescent lights. Her lip was split, one eye swollen, bruises forming across her arms and shoulders. She didn't cry. Her face remained still, almost expressionless, as the doctors stitched her lip and examined her for fractures. She answered their questions in a low voice, nodding when needed. When asked if she felt safe at home, she shook her head. When asked if she wanted to press charges, she gave a firm, single nod. By morning, the story had already leaked to several local media outlets. At first, it was reported simply as a case of domestic violence. Newlywed couple involved in assault. Incident less than 24 hours after wedding. That alone was enough to catch the public's attention. But as more details emerged, so did the shock. Journalists pieced together information from the police report, and whispers began circulating online. The bride wasn't who she appeared to be. Screenshots of documents allegedly belonging to Aina were shared on anonymous blogs. Speculation turned into wild theories, and within hours, Aina's real story was out in the open. News outlets pounced. Headlines became more dramatic. Groom discovers bride's past, turns violent. Muslim marriage ends in chaos over gender identity, and 24 hours of deception, the secret behind the bride's identity. The public reacted with fury, confusion, and morbid fascination. Social media turned into a battlefield of opinion. Some defended Aina, calling her a victim of discrimination and violence. Others condemned her, accusing her of dishonesty and betrayal. The debate was loud, relentless, and unforgiving. Aina was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, but she didn't go back to Amirul's apartment. Instead, she checked into a small hotel under a different name, using the last of her savings. She turned off her phone, deleted her social media accounts, and cut ties with anyone who might lead others to her. She knew the storm outside was just beginning. Already reporters had shown up at the apartment complex, trying to interview neighbors. Some of them spoke freely, describing what they'd heard, what they thought, what they assumed. One neighbor said Aina always seemed too reserved. Another speculated she was hiding something from the start. Meanwhile, Amirul remained in custody. His lawyer requested bail, citing his clean record and community standing, but the judge delayed the hearing, citing public interest in the case. In the cell, Amirul barely spoke. He refused to eat the first day, staring at the walls, as though waiting for them to answer questions he couldn't ask out loud. Shame filled every inch of his body. He remembered the ceremony, the prayers, the joy of his family, and the way his mother cried tears of happiness when he placed the ring on Aina's finger. Now those same tears seemed distant and misplaced. Back at Sakina Connections, the matchmaking agency, chaos was also unfolding. The owners denied any wrongdoing, claiming they had verified all personal records and had no knowledge of Aina's history. But emails between staff members began surfacing, suggesting otherwise. One leaked exchange hinted that they had indeed discovered parts of her past, but chose to withhold it to avoid losing the match. "He'll never know," one email read. "She looks and acts like a woman. They'll be fine." The exposure triggered an internal investigation, but by then, the agency had shut down its website and removed all traces of its services online. As the legal process moved forward, public interest in the case only intensified. News channels interviewed psychologists, religious scholars, and activists. Religious figures weighed in, mostly condemning Aina's decision to marry under what they called false pretenses. A prominent cleric called it a betrayal of the institution of Islamic marriage. Another accused her of disrupting the moral fabric of society. But not all voices were hostile. A few advocates for transgender rights came forward, pointing out the impossible dilemma people like Aina faced: ostracized if they tell the truth, punished if they stay silent. Still, Aina's silence remained. She didn't release any statements, didn't speak to the press. Instead, she watched the world from the safety of her hotel room, her body healing slowly while the internet tore her apart. She had expected some backlash, but not like this. She had always known that living as a woman in Malaysia came with risk, but she had hoped, desperately, naively, that her quiet, careful life would shield her from the worst of it. She had wanted a partner, a home, someone to share her faith with. That dream had ended in blood and headlines. Amirul was eventually granted bail. He returned to his apartment, but it no longer felt like home. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, family, colleagues. Some expressed concern. Others offered sympathy. A few blamed him for not being more cautious. A handful congratulated him for handling the situation like a man, a comment that made him feel sick. He didn't answer any of them. He sat in silence, haunted not only by what Aina had hidden, but by what he had done. The violence wasn't planned. It had come from a place he didn't recognize. A deep, blind rage that took control before he could stop himself. Now, it followed him everywhere. He met with his lawyer, who advised him to remain silent publicly and cooperate with the court. Privately, Amirul expressed regret, not just about the marriage, but about his actions. He didn't understand how it had gone so far. He had never seen himself as someone capable of hurting another person. But now, he was that man. And no matter how the court ruled, he would always carry that truth. The media slowly shifted its attention to other stories, but Aina and Amirul's names remained part of public conversation. In coffee shops, in mosques, on WhatsApp groups, people debated what had happened. They argued over who was right and who was wrong. Some saw it as a cautionary tale. Others used it as fuel for larger discussions about gender identity, religion, and deception. But for Aina and Amirul, it was no longer a story. It was a wound that would never fully heal, only fade over time, buried beneath layers of silence and distance. The courtroom was quiet when the hearing began, despite the buzz that had led up to the day. Reporters waited outside with cameras ready. But inside, the atmosphere was tense and subdued. The case had drawn national attention, but today the courtroom doors stayed closed to the public. Only essential parties were allowed in: the legal teams, a judge, the court recorder, and two individuals whose lives had been torn apart, Amirul and Aina. Aina entered through a side door, accompanied by her lawyer and a police escort. Her face was pale, slightly swollen around the jawline. Her long sleeves covered the healing bruises on her arms. She kept her eyes down, her expression unreadable. Amirul sat on the opposite side, dressed in a simple white shirt and dark pants, his face clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed. He looked tired, but not angry. As Aina took her seat, he didn't look at her. The case was presented as a straightforward domestic assault. The prosecution laid out the timeline, the evidence, and the severity of the injuries. The medical reports were submitted. Photos of Aina's bruises were displayed in sealed folders, not shown to the room. Witness statements from the night security, guard and neighbors were read aloud. It was clear that violence had occurred and that Amirul was the perpetrator. But the complexity of the case was not in the facts. It was in the context. That's what made it different. That's what made it delicate. Amirul's defense team argued that the situation had been emotionally explosive, the result of a profound personal betrayal. They didn't deny the assault, but framed it as a breakdown caused by emotional shock. They referenced cultural expectations, religious values, and personal trauma. It wasn't an excuse, they said. It was context. Aina's lawyer countered that no revelation, no matter how upsetting, justified physical violence. She had trusted Amirul with her past and had paid the price for it with her safety. Her intention had never been to deceive maliciously, the lawyer argued, but to live as her true self in a society that often gave people like her no safe path forward. The judge listened quietly, interjecting only when necessary. There was no jury, just a quiet authority presiding over two broken people trying to navigate a legal system unprepared for their kind of tragedy. After hours of statements, documentation, and brief testimonies, the judge called for a recess. The sentencing would be delivered the following week. Outside the courtroom, the waiting press rushed to gather reactions, but none were given. Aina was quickly escorted away, disappearing behind tinted car windows. Amirul left with his lawyer, ignoring shouted questions and flashing cameras. The moment passed quickly, but it left a shadow that lingered in headlines and online debates. In the days that followed, Aina remained in hiding. Her location was kept secret by her legal team, and she avoided public places entirely. Her lawyer advised her not to return to her job or home, both of which had been flooded with unwanted attention. Her landlord, under pressure from other tenants, had already asked her to vacate the unit she had been renting for 2 years. She complied quietly, sending someone else to collect her belongings. What little she had left of her previous life was now boxed up and stored in a safe house provided by an NGO. Amirul returned to work under strict conditions. His company placed him on administrative leave pending the court's final decision. His colleagues treated him with a mix of distance and discomfort. No one asked questions, but everyone knew. His once quiet reputation as a devout and humble man had been permanently fractured. Though some still offered private support, others couldn't hide their disapproval. In the prayer room, a few kept their distance. At lunch, conversations paused when he walked past. He began attending therapy sessions, something he had never considered before. At first, he sat in silence, offering little more than shrugs and nods. But gradually, he began to open up. He spoke about his upbringing, his beliefs, his confusion. He talked about his shame, his anger, not just at Aina, but at himself. He couldn't understand how someone who had grown up with such strong faith had allowed violence to take over. The therapist listened without judgment, guiding him to recognize the pain behind his actions, not to excuse it, but to understand it. For Aina, the healing process was slower. The physical wounds faded, but the fear remained. She couldn't sleep. Through the night without jolting awake. She jumped at loud noises. She avoided mirrors. Her lawyer arranged for a psychologist to help her navigate the trauma, but Aina struggled to trust anyone. She spoke in short sentences, kept her emotions locked behind tired eyes. The betrayal, the public exposure, and the violence had all merged into one long shadow she couldn't escape. She started writing in a journal, something she hadn't done in years. Each entry was short, fragmented, like puzzle pieces of a past she was trying to make sense of. She wrote about her childhood, the first time she realized she was different, the loneliness of transition, and the fleeting joy she had felt when Amirul first accepted her. She had believed he saw her for who she was. She had been wrong. The court reconvened a week later. This time, the press was kept entirely outside. Only legal representatives and the parties involved were present. Amirul was sentenced to 9 months of community service and mandatory counseling. The court recognized the emotional complexity of the case but held firm that violence was never justifiable. He was also required to pay for Aina's medical expenses and issue a formal written apology through the court. The judge noted that the sentence was lighter than typical for domestic assault, not out of mercy, but because both parties had been victims in different ways, victims of secrecy, societal pressure, and systemic failure. Aina accepted the outcome, without expression. She didn't speak to Amirul, didn't look at him. After the hearing, she left the courtroom and didn't return to the city. She relocated to a different state with the help of a support organization. There, under a new name, she began rebuilding her life. Slowly, she started applying for freelance work, kept her identity quiet, and tried to find moments of peace in long walks and quiet mornings. Trust was still distant, but hope, faint as it was, had not completely disappeared. Amirul too began the long process of facing himself. He completed his community service in a halfway home, helping those who had suffered abuse. At first, the work felt uncomfortable, but eventually, he began to understand the people he was helping. Their stories, though different from his own, were soaked in pain, betrayal, and recovery. He began to see the bigger picture, how cycles of harm often came from wounds that had never healed. The story of Aina and Amirul faded from the headlines, but remained etched in the minds of those who had followed it. It became more than a scandal. It became a reflection of the fractures in a society struggling to make sense of identity, faith, and justice. For some, it was a cautionary tale. For others, a mirror held up to their deepest fears. But for Aina and Amirul, It was simply their lives, forever altered, irreversibly divided, yet quietly continuing on separate paths. In the months that followed the trial, both Aina and Amirul faded from public view. The story that had once captivated the nation became just another closed file, buried beneath newer controversies and fresher scandals. But for the two people, at the heart of it, the aftermath was far from over. Their lives had changed permanently, shaped by a moment of violence that neither could undo. Aina, now living under a new identity in a small coastal town, tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. The town was quiet, untouched by the media frenzy that had consumed the capital. No one knew her past. To them, she was just another newcomer looking for a fresh start. She rented a modest room above a bookstore and spent her days working remotely for a design agency that didn't require her to appear in video calls. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was safe. For now, safety was enough. Each morning she walked along the shoreline, listening to the waves as they lapped gently against the rocks. The sea brought her a strange comfort. Its quiet persistence reminded her of her own survival. She had endured shame, pain, and betrayal, yet she was still here. Sometimes she found herself wondering what might have been if she had told Amirul the truth earlier, if he had reacted differently, if their marriage had been given a real chance. But those thoughts were fleeting. She knew better than to live in what-ifs. Healing came slowly. Trust, even more so. She avoided social gatherings and rarely ventured beyond the familiar paths near her new home. But within those limitations, she found a rhythm. She began journaling again, not just to cope, but to remember who she was. The pages filled with sketches, thoughts, and fragments of poetry. It was a private space where she didn't need to explain or justify anything. In those words, she rediscovered a part of herself that had been silenced for too long. Meanwhile, Amirul continued his own process of reconciliation. He completed his court-mandated counseling and community service without resistance. The work at the halfway house had changed him. At first, he had kept his distance, unsure of how to speak to those he was helping. But over time, their stories broke through his silence. He listened to men and women recount their trauma, many caused by people who were supposed to protect them. The shame he had carried began to shift, replaced by understanding and remorse. He didn't forgive himself, but he began to acknowledge what he had done. At the mosque, Amirul kept his head down. He avoided Friday prayers for months, choosing instead to pray alone at home. When he finally returned, the stares were fewer than he feared. Some members offered quiet nods, others avoided eye contact. But no one said anything cruel. The community's judgment, once a source of anxiety, no longer weighed as heavily on him. He understood now that redemption wasn't about being accepted again. It was about changing, even when no one was watching. He took up reading again, poring through books on faith, psychology, and gender identity. He wanted to understand what had happened beyond the surface of emotion. The more he read, the more he realized how little he had known, not just about Aina, but about the complexities of human identity and the harm ignorance could cause. His anger, once rooted in betrayal, had evolved into something more difficult: regret. There were nights when he thought about writing to her. Not to ask for forgiveness, he knew he had no right to, but to acknowledge what he had done. He even drafted a few letters, each one more raw than the last, but he never sent them. Instead, he burned them in a small metal bowl on his balcony, watching the ashes rise into the night air. It felt like the only form of release he was entitled to. Far away, Aina continued moving forward. The scars on her face had faded, but the memories lingered. She kept a small notebook of headlines about her case, just a few clippings she had saved before everything disappeared. She didn't read them often, but she couldn't throw them away. They were part of her story, even if they didn't tell it fully. One evening, while walking back from the grocery store, Aina passed by a community center with a flyer pinned to the gate. It advertised a workshop on storytelling for survivors. She paused, reading the details twice before folding the flyer and putting it in her pocket. For days, she debated whether to attend. When she finally did, she sat in the back, saying nothing. The stories she heard that night weren't exactly like hers, but they carried the same weight of survival. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as a headline or a scandal, but as a person with a voice worth hearing. She began attending the sessions regularly. Eventually, she shared her own story, carefully, anonymously, and without drama. Just the facts. The words came slowly, but when they did, they brought a strange relief. People listened. No one interrupted. No one judged. Afterward, one of the facilitators approached her, gently offering encouragement. Aina didn't respond with much more than a nod, but it was enough. That night, she cried, not out of pain, but release. Back in the city, Amirul had begun volunteering at the same center he had once served through court order. This time, it was his choice. He led workshops on accountability, speaking not as a teacher, but as someone who had caused harm and was still trying to make amends. He never mentioned Aina by name, but those who knew his story understood the subtext. His presence stirred mixed feelings. Some believed he had no right to lead. Others saw the effort as meaningful. Amirul didn't push anyone to believe in him. He simply showed up, again and again. Months turned into a year. Aina published a short piece in a community newsletter under a pseudonym. It was a reflection on survival and identity, written in soft, honest language. The piece gained quiet recognition, passed around in online groups focused on healing and resilience. She received a few messages through the anonymous contact listed at the bottom. Some thanked her. Others shared their own experiences. One message stood out. It didn't reveal the sender's identity, but the words were familiar. They were gentle, sincere, regretful. Aina read it once and then deleted it. She didn't need closure from him. She had already begun building her own. In time, the noise that had once surrounded them disappeared. No more interviews, no more speculation. Just two people, no longer connected, living their separate lives. They would probably never meet again. But the story they shared had left a mark on themselves, on those who heard it, and on a society forced to look at uncomfortable truths. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest one. And sometimes, that was the most anyone could hope for.